and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden of the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, it has been a fascinating week in geopolitics, as always with the United States and my president, Donald Trump. It's never boring. But last week, there were these comments that came out of the White House, or allegedly came out of the White House, because there is some dispute now, describing in rather vulgar terms African countries. No need for me to actually say the word because A, I don't want to get kicked off of iTunes, but B, most of you have probably already heard the word. So that actually isn't the interesting part of this conversation. The reaction in Africa has been swift. The fact that so many people are offended by those comments, and remember, this is not just the only thing that he's done to insult Africans. Nambia was one, describing Nigerians coming to the United States, and once they see America, they're not going to want to go back to their quote-unquote their huts. So this has been really a string of comments from the president that has not gone over well in Africa. Now, the reason why we're going to be talking about it today is in part trying to measure the impact that this may be having on the security situation in Africa, particularly in context of the Chinese. So it's a long stretch to go from vulgarity to a security situation. It's one of the reasons why, Cobus, you and I have been struggling to draw a straight line between the actions of the president and security. But there's an article in the New York Times that came out on January 15th. Trump comments infuriating Africans may set back U.S. interests. Now, remember what U.S. interests are in Africa today. They are heavily invested in the war against terrorism, particularly in places like Nigeria and Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda in the Sahel, also against Al-Shabaab in East Africa as well. And there are serious financial interests. So while the president may not have an appreciation for the level of American commitment in Africa, certainly Africans recognize this. So, Cobus, help me better understand what your take is on this. Your president, Cyril Ramaphosa, your new ANC party leader, Ramaphosa, he said that he was very upset by this. He's called in the American ambassador. Botswana has also called in the American ambassador. When you heard the comments and you see the reaction, set the table for us in terms of how this may play with the Chinese.
There's a few things to keep in mind here. In the first place, the comments drew a lot of attention from Africa. But at the same time, they came in the context of very stark kind of budget, changes in the U.S. budget, or then the proposed budget, because that budget still needs to be clarified and confirmed, which would, on the one hand, somewhat increase U.S. military spending, and then the Secretary of Defense James Mattis in October said that the U.S. military is planning to refocus a lot of its attention on Africa. So that's happening. On the other hand, it also slashes a lot of state, like 30% of the State Department budget. So what you have is, while some kind of military engagement in Africa U.S. military engagement is increasing, you see a simultaneous decreasing of U.S. diplomatic engagement. So you see a kind of a narrowing of U.S. focus. With some of the kind of public diplomacy and other kind of development outreach that they did under the Obama administration being narrowed down, while military engagement is being boosted. So of course, this is happening in the context of the Chinese building a base in Africa. Chinese being very involved in multilateral peacekeeping in Africa. And multilateralism is the issue here, because the Trump administration is also planning to slash budgets for multilateral peacekeeping. So there's some of their contributions to the UN, is apparently being lessened. And at the same time, the UN ambassador Nikki Haley in October visited Africa, and she was talking up bilateral peacekeeping instead. So you see it possibly moving from kind of a wide-ranging kind of UN-esque framework, which opens the possibility for wide-ranging participation, including a lot of different countries, to these kind of bilateral relationships where the power balance is much steeper. So it puts a lot of what China's doing in Africa, it puts into a kind of a new context.
So the comments and the reaction to the comments came actually right now, Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, is currently on a four-nation tour, and he is actually responding to them as well. And maybe not directly, but he is presenting China as a stable partner. He's reaffirming the Chinese government's commitment to Africa, both in a security context as well as in a broader diplomatic engagement. And that brings us again to this question of security and a stable partner. And there's an interesting new book that's coming out, Seeking Security, China's Expanding Involvement in Security Cooperation in Africa. It's by Chris Alden, who's an old friend of our programs. And also he co-authored it, and it's been co-edited as well by Abian Alao and Zhang Chun from the Institute of International Studies here in Shanghai. And so we're very pleased, Chris, to have you back on the show to talk about your upcoming book and really all the moving chess pieces on the board of geopolitics right now.
Thank you.
Before we get into your book and the question of Chinese security, I'd like to get your take on this issue of the Trump comments, and again, not specifically in relation to the vulgarity, but really more in relation to the changing U.S. relationship with Africa and how that may or may not benefit China.
I think that the attitude that's expressed by Trump in those words has a policy meaning. The cut, as Cobus just mentioned, the cutting of the budget in the State Department, the fact that there's no Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs appointed as yet, the fact that ambassadorial appointments haven't been made across the diplomatic range of U.S. embassies in Africa, all of these speak to the diminishing attention, and while Africa was never central to U.S. Foreign policy, nonetheless, it had a position and a place. I mean, George W. Bush organized the PEPFAR program, which is underwritten AIDS support, HIV support rather, for a number of countries, a very important element, a development element. That's going to be wound down. So all of these things have are expressions of a retreat. You know, that attitude really has policy meaning as a retreat from engagement on the continent, and only selectively so, as you said a moment ago, about bilateral peacekeeping operations as a possible U.S. response.
Chris, can you give us an outline of roughly where China stands at the moment in relation to African security? What are some of its biggest engagements? And what are some of the biggest security roles that it's currently playing in Africa?
Well, it's grown its role. It's something that, while not new, it's been a gradualist development. It didn't have a position of substance really until 1990 in the peacekeeping component, and we've seen China slowly but surely ratchet up its involvement in terms of contributions financially, contributions of peacekeepers, and in more recent, and contributions in terms of mediation. So those are strong features of Chinese engagement in African security through multilateral channels. On a bilateral, at a bilateral level, you've mentioned the base in Djibouti, which will serve as a platform both for naval operations, but as we understand, at least as reported in Hong Kong newspapers, there will be up to 10,000 Marines, Chinese Marines, assigned to it as well. So there's that dimension, which is growing as well. And then finally, there are a set of bilateral military relationships, the kind of thing that countries have with military attachés, perhaps training programs, the selling of arms, and those sorts of things. So it's a pretty broad sweep of involvement on the African continent, but something that's been gradualist in its arrival.
A lot of people are actually quite surprised to hear that just how the breadth of Chinese military engagement is in Africa. The troop numbers somewhere around 3,300 at the last count that I had. It could be higher now. Combat troops in South Sudan as part of multinational peacekeeping operations there. Troops deployed in Mali. Of course, off the coast of Somalia, there is the PLA Navy, who's been doing anti-piracy operations for the past 10 years, UN deployments in the DRC and other places. So it's really spread, and as you said, it's a gradualist approach. And you talked about how, in your book, how the military response in Africa from the Chinese is in response to three threats that they face. There is and I'd like you to talk about those three threats: business interests, their citizens living there, and also the reputational risks that they face. If you could walk us through those three threats, that would be interesting.
These flow from the economic exposure, as China, and it's a logical follow-up of the going out policy, the increasing engagement in all aspects of economic activity across the African continent, but first and foremost in the energy and resource sector. What happened, and one would expect this, as more Chinese businesses were opening up, more state-owned enterprises were situating themselves in African locations, and again, resources require a physical presence in ways that other kinds of businesses might not. So you are immediately engaged with and exposed to the various political, infrastructural, social problems that might surround you or your particular operation in ways that wouldn't be the case in a different kind of industry or sector. So that economic exposure, produced the sort of tensions in some cases which affected the ability of firms to operate. It drew some criminal elements within the host governments, within the host societies, rather, targeting Chinese citizens. So Chinese citizens as individuals, firms themselves found they might be targeted, taken hostage, even killed. Firms themselves were exposed to the vagaries of political control, changes in government, pressures from the host government to extract more value from their operations there. So those sorts of concerns. The behavior of those firms as well spilled over into the China brand, if you like, in Africa, or the reputational elements. So if some of the famous cases in Zambia, if you have Chinese firms that are unfortunately involved in strike action where local trade union activists are shot at or killed, this produces a very negative image of China as a economic actor within the particular country. Reputational risks were beyond that, though. If you look at in 2005, 2006, China was exposed in Sudan to the criticism, increasingly exposed to criticism for its association with the government of Khartoum around Darfur and the Darfur crisis and what have you. So on the international stage, its reputation was tarnished, increasingly tarnished by its involvement in the continent. It needed to take positions. It needed to negotiate. It needed to find ways to secure better deals for its firms and in fact haul up Chinese firms that weren't behaving well and causing reputational problems, state-owned and otherwise. And it needed to find a way to, when crises happen, the most dramatic of them, of course, is the Arab Spring and the Libya evacuation. It needed to find better ways to protect its citizens.
Chris, can you give us an idea of how effective Chinese peacekeeping has been in Africa? Well, I'm assuming there's a whole bunch of different ways of measuring that, but to which extent can they be seen as having had a real kind of peace building, peacekeeping effect on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, Chinese peacekeeping is fitted, of course, within a multilateral peacekeeping, a UN-led peacekeeping itself, and they generally have two or three functions. One is to mediate and maintain and observe a ceasefire. Then the second is more activist, that is to say, facilitating the peace-building side, not just separation of hostile forces, but going in there and beginning training, police training, beginning to restore institutions and stability and what have you. So China has fitted itself within that program, and by most accounts, done quite well at this. An additional thing, and the bulk of the peacekeepers have been involved in the infrastructure side, that is, an engineering and medical treatment as well. It is only since 2013, as Eric mentioned, that we see combat-ready troops being involved in this. Recently in Sudan, of course, in South Sudan, there's been some controversy as to the responsiveness of Chinese peacekeepers to a particular incident, and there have been several accounts. NGOs have criticized Chinese peacekeepers as not responding to threats of violence to the civilian populations by militias and other groups. The Chinese have said, in fact, the problem was the head of the mission, who was a Kenyan who was subsequently dismissed and replaced by a Chinese UN military commander. So there is a little bit of kerfuffle around that and disputed accounts. Having said that, since the Chinese UN commander had completed his tour of duty there, during that period there was no notable outcry or problem as there had been in the previous commander's role. So there's a decent record there.
Chris, there's one part of this that I'm struggling to get my head around, and you've touched on it a little bit here. So let me kind of put a couple data points on the map and see if you can string them together, because I haven't been able to. A few years ago, I think it was back in 2015, the Chinese government changed its anti-terrorism law that allows for the Chinese military or special operations to to deploy troops to foreign countries without their consent in order to preserve Chinese people and property. So that's point number one. Point number two is the increased deployment of combat troops. And then you've talked a lot about the risks that are associated with it. And there's a political risk here in China as well. And it comes from the fact that Xi Jinping is the strongest president in modern Chinese history, really since the Deng era, from Deng Xiaoping, about 30 years. And it doesn't look good for him if his people are being taken captive in places like Mali or being killed in Syria by ISIS. And let's not forget, of course, that China has its own Muslim challenges out in Xinjiang, as well as challenges with ISIS as well. And so in the era of Wolf Warrior II, where the Chinese is projecting this very, very strong interventionist message, it seems to put the non-interference doctrine that has really defined Chinese foreign policy for a half century in question. So how do we reconcile those different points with adherence to the non-interference doctrine, which says we will not interfere in another country's internal affairs, when in fact the pressure seems to be pushing Chinese military intervention either for security or even on a multinational basis, but still nonetheless, Chinese forces are being deployed in other countries. And I just wonder, how does that square circle?
Yeah, I mean, the non-interference policy will I think, remain something that features in the rhetoric of China's involvement. They increasingly redefine what it means to interfere. So intervention is possible. By the mid to late 2000s, intervention was possible if by invitation and supported by through multilateral means. So there, refinement from a sort of universal claim to non-interference to one where interventions of a certain kind are supported has been part of that gradualist engagement that I mentioned earlier, the ratcheting up of more troops and expanding legal basis, which you mentioned, for Chinese action. The other thing I would say is that I think that non-interference has been increasingly replaced in the sense of in the sense that Xi Jinping's government talks much more about great power diplomacy with Chinese characteristics. So I think that this idea that he's trying to transmigrate away from the constraints that non-interference policy places on action to solve the problems you've mentioned, the dangers felt by citizens, the need to be more activist globally, to step up to the plate as the United States and perhaps some of the European countries, others become less involved. China has certainly, she's made it a point since 2015, going to the United Nations to indicate that China would be supporting financially and in terms of troop deployments, 8,000 standby troops, peacekeeping troops to be made available, was part of what he told the gathered assembly, and also $1 billion over a 10-year period to support peace-building operations, what he called what was in translation peace building, but peacekeeping operations of any kind. So these are, I think, part of that. It's also, as you said, it's a domestic. There's a strong domestic driver to this. That when people get on WeChat and complain about the fact that no one's looking after Chinese citizens, that they're out there alone in foreign locations, and in fact even under threat. The Chinese government needs to respond to that. That's a point of concern for them domestically. It's not just a foreign policy problem.
To bring the conversation back to the U.S. and China in Africa, I was surprised when I was reading about the development of the U.S. military engagement with Africa under Trump, and I was surprised to read that some of very senior people in AFRICOM, which is obviously the U.S.'s main command in Africa, were quite open, or they expressed themselves to be quite open to collaboration with China in Africa. Do you foresee collaboration between the US and China on shared kind of peacekeeping under Trump, or is that not on the cards?
Yeah, I've seen similar sorts of statements. I've also we've had a debate, at least led by the U.S. Congress as to whether this is in the interests of the United States and what have you. So you've got, I think, more of a debate between them. I think the people on the ground see this as people on the ground in Africa, U.S. commanders and the like, see this as a positive and constructive component of solving the security problems in the region they're located. I think there are political problems that spillovers from the general tightening of relations between the United States and China in the East China Sea, South China Sea, and all of that. So I think that dynamic is having an impact on what would otherwise be a much more collaborative, a clear call for collaboration on all parties' parts.
You're being very diplomatic. I will be less diplomatic. There is no way on God's green earth that the United States military and China and the PLA will ever collaborate, particularly in Africa. I mean, it's just not, the optics of that, particularly in the Trump era, are impossible to imagine. I mean, they're not even selling Huawei phones in America because they're afraid of the Chinese military, much less actually having collaboration on the ground. I'm highly skeptical of that. And I don't think there's a lot of appetite here in China for that either. Particularly the idea that there's this feeling that the U.S. military is containing China in the South China Sea and other places and taking the side of Japan in disputes and causing problems on the Korean Peninsula. It just doesn't seem, I mean, I read that article, Cobus, a long time ago, and it seems highly improbable that we'll ever see that day. But let me close our discussion here on a mixed note. So on the one hand, you talk about all the positive things that China's doing in Africa in security, and it does seem like it's positive. The fact that the United States wants to cut its engagement with the UN in Africa, and here's China stepping up, deploying more humanitarian troops, peacekeeping, post-conflict resolution, all of that is great stuff. But there's a darker side to all of this, and you talk about it in your book about arms transfers, particularly small arms transfers, which is particularly insidious in a place anywhere around the world. But they're harder to trace. They're highly deadly. And Chinese weapon sales as well, drones, aircraft, ships. It's building to a little bit of an arms race in some parts of Africa as well. And so talk to us a little bit about the darker side and the small arms transfers and what that does to the security environment.
Yeah, small arms are, we're not seeing major conventional military operations in Africa. It is led by small arms, more or less. And so Chinese arms did not initially feature a decade and a half ago, but gradually they are increasingly, they've increased their exposure. They're the third largest trader in arms. They are going, again, in a kind of, they're becoming more involved in light arms, artillery, all sorts of things like that. So small arms in particular, they know no boundaries. It is surprising to me that the Chinese don't see the problem, because those same arms have reputational risks of their own kind to their peacekeeping image. They have reputational risks in terms of the attitude of citizens when these arms that are sold by one hand of China end up being used against Chinese interests. And there is evidence of that already. So I do think this dark side is not only problematic for what it does in Africa, but it's also problematic if one looks at it closely, for the very things that China hopes to achieve in Africa, which is to show stability, show that friendship, etc.
The book is Seeking Security, China's Expanding Involvement in Security Cooperation in Africa. Chris, when's the book coming out? When can we expect to see it on bookshelves?
It's out. It's
out?
Yes, it's out. I think it's ebooks form, but I have a physical copy within sight. So
I got a PDF, so I always assume when I get a PDF, it's an advanced copy. So it's out. It's fantastic. I hope it's not one of these academic books that cost $8,000 to buy one copy of it.
We have bad news for you.
I won't say,
so people can't.
I won't say anything about that, actually.
Oh, that's what's so criminal about this. You guys do some great work, and yet normal people can't buy it because it's not available on a Kindle and it costs $1 gazillion. So
the academic publishing industry is one of the most corrupt fields in the world.
So Chris Alden is an international relations professor at the London School of Economics and Political Sciences, and he's really one of the most well-known China-Africa scholars out there, and he's also a research associate with Cobus there at the South African Institute for International Affairs, and also in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria. He co-authored and co-edited the book with Laura Barber, Abiana Lo, and Zhang Chun of the Institute of International Studies right here in Shanghai. Chris, thank you so much for joining us again. Best of luck with the book, and really it's a fascinating read.
Thank you so much.
Cobus, I love this discussion because it really reaffirms that we are in a new world. I remember back in 2012 when I was in Paris, and for the first time, a Chinese battle group was in the Mediterranean. And that really just struck me as like, wow, this is a new era that we're in. And in hearing Chris walk through all of the complexities and the thought that's been put into on the part of the Chinese and how they're evolving strategy for security in Africa, it's a different world that we're in. And I think the problem that you're going to face in Africa is that too often people look at foreign military intervention or a presence on the continent in strictly colonial and imperial terms, because that's the way it's been for centuries. And I just think that the Chinese are playing by a different set of rules. And there really is no precedent for what they're doing in places like Africa that we can reference. So I'm not saying it's necessarily benevolent. I'm not saying that the intentions are always good. What I am saying is that the way the Chinese are going about this is very, very different than what we've seen during the Cold War with the Soviets and the Americans, and certainly during the imperial and the colonial era.
They're also stepping into a new defense and peacekeeping environment. So one of the things that an expert that I spoke to about the Trump Africa defense issues pointed out to me was that despite the fact that the Trump administration is putting a lot more attention to Africa, that doesn't necessarily translate to having more American boots on the ground in Africa. It'll probably translate into a lot more drone-based attacks and a lot more surveillance. And so the Chinese military is stepping into this environment where a lot of the engagement that's happening in Africa already is this kind of long distance, controlled from some kind of facility in Idaho or somewhere, kind of, surveillance and counterterrorism operations. So it is very interesting to compare and to think about how they're going to be reacting in that kind of security environment in a place like Africa.
So the base in Djibouti was the first overseas military base for the Chinese. Chris Alden pointed out that it may ramp up to 10,000 Marines that are eventually based there one day. We're getting word now of a second military base that will be based overseas, and it's in Pakistan. Again, this came through the Pakistani media, so they have a sketchy record for being accurate, but that does actually make sense. And what the theme is between Djibouti and Pakistan is that these are points on the Belt and Road trading route. And I'm going to imagine that if the Chinese are going to invest upwards of $1 trillion, and even if they don't hit $1 trillion, let's call it $750 billion, or whatever it is, it's a huge amount of money, they're going to want to secure that trade route. Particularly along vulnerable parts of it in the Indian Ocean, certainly through the Suez Canal, through the Middle East. Those are highly vulnerable areas to attack, to being taken captive, to terrorism and whatnot. And so we should expect to see a lot more Chinese overseas military engagement. And many of the things that are going on in Africa today seem to be the precursor for what's happening in other parts of the world. So I think it's really important to understand the trends that are happening here in Africa and then to look at them, how they apply to the rest of the world. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. We'll be back again next week with another show. In between, if you'd like to stay in touch with the latest China-Africa news, we've got this fantastic newsletter we hope that you can sign up for. Every Monday, Cobus and I put out the top 5 or 6 stories of the week, and it's just a great way to stay in touch with all the different news without kind of getting too much. Of course, if you want to follow Cobus and I on social media, we'll have all the address and information coming up for that. But I invite you also to join me on LinkedIn. Look me up, Eric Olander. 500,000 people now are on this page having a discussion every day. And what's great about LinkedIn is that the discussions are so much more intelligent than what we hear on other social media platforms, partially because people have their professional profiles attached to it. So if you're going to start flaming and trolling people, it doesn't really look good for your job prospects when you're on LinkedIn doing that. But if you really want an intelligent discussion, I really urge you to check out what we're doing over on LinkedIn, and it's fantastic. And so, Cobus, we got to get your LinkedIn page up a little bit.
My LinkedIn page is up, actually. It just needs to be kind of developed and worked.
So we got to share some love, everybody, with Cobus to get his page up to 500,000 as well. So for Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. We'll be back again next week. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show, or follow China Africa News that's updated every 4 hours, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadenesque or Eric at Olander. That's EOLANDER. Subscribe to the China Africa podcast on iTunes or download the mobile apps for iOS, Android, or Windows Phone. Just head over to your favorite store and search for China Africa.